On the morning of April 16, 1945, the destroyer USS Laffey took up her position at Radar Picket Station No. 1, the most dangerous assignment in the Pacific Fleet. She was 30 miles north of Okinawa, alone except for a few support vessels, her mission to serve as an early warning against Japanese air attacks heading for the invasion fleet. The crew knew what this meant. Picket stations were magnets for kamikazes, the suicide aircraft that had transformed the nature of naval warfare in the war's final year. Other destroyers had already been sunk or crippled on these stations. The men of Laffey understood they were bait. The ship herself was young, commissioned barely a year earlier, in February 1944. She was an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, 2,100 tons of steel and machinery, armed with 6 5-inch guns, 12 40mm anti-aircraft cannons, and 11 20mm guns. Her crew numbered 336 officers and men, most of them barely out of their teens. Her commander was Frederick Julian Becton, a 37-year-old career officer from Texas who had already survived the sinking of one destroyer earlier in the war. Becton had a reputation for aggressive ship handling and cool judgment under fire. Both would be tested beyond anything he could have imagined. The Battle for Okinawa was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, and Japan was throwing everything it had left into its defense. The kamikaze strategy, born of desperation the previous October during the Philippines campaign, had evolved into a systematic weapon. Japanese commanders calculated that a pilot willing to die could guarantee a hit against an enemy ship, trading one aircraft and one life for damage that conventional attacks could rarely achieve. The mathematics were brutal, but compelling. A destroyer killed meant hundreds of American sailors dead and a valuable warship removed from the fleet. The Japanese called these missions kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, and they organized them in massive waves timed to coincide with critical moments of the invasion. April 16th was the third major kikusui attack, and Laffey was directly in its path. The first warning came at 8:27 in the morning, when radar operators detected large formations of Japanese aircraft approaching from the north. Within minutes, the skies seemed to fill with enemies. Over the next 80 minutes, Laffey would face 22 separate kamikaze attacks, plus additional strafing runs from conventional fighters. No single ship in naval history had ever endured such concentrated aerial assault. The first attacker came in low over the water, a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighter, its pilot committed to crashing into Laffey's superstructure. The ship's gun crews opened fire at maximum range, filling the air with tracers and shell bursts. The Oscar staggered, trailing smoke, but kept coming. At the last moment, Becton ordered hard rudder, and the aircraft slammed into the sea just off the port side, close enough to spray the deck with burning fuel. The crew had no time to celebrate. 2 more aircraft were already beginning their runs. The second kamikaze struck home. A Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, hit multiple times but still flying, crashed into the after deck house, destroying the No. 3 5-inch gun mount and killing several men instantly. Fires erupted. Damage control parties rushed to contain them, even as the ship's remaining guns continued to fire at new attackers. The third plane missed, pulled down into the sea by anti-aircraft fire. The fourth was a bomb rather than a suicide aircraft, a 500-pound weapon that penetrated the fantail and detonated below decks, jamming the rudder hard to port. Laffey began circling, unable to steer, her maneuverability gone at the moment she needed it most. Becton's response to this crisis would define his legacy. A lesser commander might have focused on the steering failure, might have allowed the loss of control to paralyze his decision-making. Becton instead ordered the engine room to steer by varying the speed of the propellers, a technique that was imprecise but better than nothing. He kept fighting, directing the remaining guns, encouraging the crew over the loudspeaker system, refusing to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. His voice, calm and steady despite the chaos, would be remembered by survivors as their anchor in the storm. The attacks continued with horrifying regularity. A VAL dive bomber crashed into the No. 2 gun mount, silencing another pair of 5-inch guns and starting new fires. A bomb struck the forward deck, killing the men at the No. 1 mount. Another kamikaze hit the port side amidships, its explosion killing and wounding dozens. The ship's medical staff, overwhelmed by casualties, set up aid stations in every available space. Men with shrapnel wounds kept fighting their guns. Men with burns kept hauling ammunition. The dead were left where they fell because the living had no time to move them. By 9 o'clock, barely 30 minutes into the battle, Laffey had been hit 4 times by kamikazes and twice by bombs. Her aftersection was a shambles of twisted metal and burning wreckage. Half her main battery was destroyed. Her rudder was jammed. Dozens of her crew were dead or wounded. Any reasonable assessment would have concluded that the ship was finished, that continued resistance was pointless. But Laffey kept shooting, and her crew kept fighting, and the Japanese kept coming. The 5th kamikaze hit killed most of the men in the after-repair party. The 6th struck near the waterline, opening the hull to the sea. The 7th was shot down at the last second, close enough that burning debris rained across the deck. The 8th missed when the pilot, hit by anti-aircraft fire, lost control and cartwheeled into the ocean. The 9th and 10th came simultaneously from different angles, a coordinated attack that left even Becton momentarily uncertain which to engage first. One missed, one hit, adding to the inferno consuming the ship's stern. The men on Laffey's guns fought with a fury that transcended training or discipline. They were fighting for their lives, certainly, but also for each other, for the ship that had become their home, for something larger than themselves that they could not have articulated, but felt with absolute conviction. Gun crews whose mounts were destroyed grabbed rifles and pistols and fired at attacking aircraft, a gesture that was tactically meaningless but psychologically essential. Ammunition handlers whose stations were aflame kept carrying shells to functioning guns, running through fire because the guns needed feeding. The wounded refused evacuation. The dying kept working until they could work no more. The Japanese pilots, for their part, displayed a determination that matched their enemies. These were not the elite aviators of earlier war years, most of whom had long since been killed. They were hastily trained volunteers, many with fewer than 100 flight hours, sent on missions from which there was no return. Their aircraft were often obsolete, patched together from spare parts, and equipped with whatever weapons were available. What they lacked in skill, they compensated with conviction. They believed they were saving their homeland, that their deaths would mean something, that the divine wind, Kamikaze, would sweep the invaders from Japanese waters. They were wrong, but they did not know it, and their errors do not diminish their courage. At approximately 9:30, an hour into the battle, help finally began to arrive. Marine Corsair fighters from Okinawa, vectored to Laffey's position by frantic radio calls, fell upon the Japanese formations with guns blazing. The Corsairs were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with hundreds of combat hours. They began shooting down kamikazes before they could reach the crippled destroyer. But the battle was not yet over. Several Japanese aircraft broke through the fighter screen, pressing their attacks despite everything the Americans could throw at them. The 11th kamikaze hit Laffey squarely on the fantail, destroying what remained of the aftergun mounts and killing the men who had been fighting fires there. The 12th was shot down by a Corsair at the last moment, crashing so close to the ship that the explosion rocked her hull. The 13th missed when the pilot, perhaps disoriented by smoke or damage, misjudged his approach and plunged into the sea ahead of the ship. The 14th struck the deck near the forward stack, penetrating deep into the ship before its bomb exploded, blowing a hole in the hull below the waterline. Laffey was now listing to port, down by the stern, on fire in multiple locations, steering only by her engines, with more than half her armament destroyed and casualties mounting by the minute. Becton faced a decision that every naval commander dreads: whether to abandon ship. The protocol was clear. When a vessel could no longer fight and could not be saved, the captain's duty was to save his crew. But Becton looked at his ship, at the men still manning the guns, at the damage control parties still fighting the fires, and he made a different choice. Laffey would not be abandoned. She would fight until she sank or until the enemy stopped coming. There would be no surrender. The 15th and 16th kamikazes came within seconds of each other, both shot down by the combination of ship's guns and marine fighters, their wreckage adding to the debris field surrounding the battered destroyer. The 17th was a near-miss bomb that opened new leaks below the waterline. The 18th was another suicide crash, this one into the already devastated stern, killing men who had somehow survived everything that came before. The 19th was shot down well short of the ship, a testament to the Corsairs now circling protectively overhead. The 20th missed when Laffey, even with her jammed rudder, somehow managed to present a harder target than the pilot expected. By 10 o'clock, the attacks were diminishing in intensity. Japanese aircraft, harried by fighters and low on fuel, began to withdraw. The 21st kamikaze turned away at the last moment, either deterred by anti-aircraft fire or losing his nerve at the sight of the burning but still fighting destroyer. The 22nd and final attacker was a lone Val that emerged from a cloud bank, dove toward Laffey's bridge, and was torn apart by concentrated fire just 50 yards from the ship, its wreckage showering the forecastle with burning fragments. And then it was over. 80 minutes of continuous combat, 22 separate attack runs, 6 kamikaze hits, 4 bomb hits, and Laffey was still afloat. Her stern was a ruin. Her superstructure was shattered. 32 of her crew were dead, another 71 wounded. She could not steer, could barely move, was taking on water from multiple breaches. But she was still afloat, still flying the American flag, still crewed by men who refused to accept that their ship could be killed. The rescue and salvage operation that followed was almost as remarkable as the battle itself. The destroyer USS Macomb came alongside to assist with firefighting and damage control. The fleet tug Pacana took Laffey under tow, beginning the long, slow journey to the anchorage at Karama, Reto. For hours, the crew worked to shore up bulkheads, plug leaks, and stabilize the ship against the constant threat of capsizing. Men who had been fighting for their lives at 10 in the morning were fighting to save their ship at midnight, working through exhaustion because giving up was simply not an option. Laffey reached Karamaretto under tow, her stern so low in the water that waves washed over her fantail. There, Navy repair crews performed emergency work that would allow her to make the longer voyage to a proper shipyard. She was patched, pumped out, and eventually towed to Seattle, where she would spend the rest of the war in dry dock, undergoing repairs. She would never fight again, but she would survive to become a museum ship, preserved at Patriots Point in South Carolina, where visitors can still walk her decks and imagine what happened there on April 16, 1945. The Battle of Picket Station. Number 1 earned Laffey a nickname that would follow her through history: the ship that would not die. It was not hyperbole. No other ship in the Pacific War endured as many kamikaze hits and survived. No other crew fought off as many attackers in a single engagement. The action became a legend in naval circles, studied in war colleges, cited as an example of what determination and leadership can accomplish against overwhelming odds. Becton received the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor. Dozens of his crew received medals of their own. The ship herself was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. But the statistics and decorations, important as they are, do not fully capture what happened that morning. To understand Laffey's fight, you must understand the men who fought it, their backgrounds, their training, their motivations. These were not superhuman warriors. They were ordinary Americans, drawn from farms and factories and schools across the country, transformed by a few months of naval training into something capable of enduring what should have been unendurable. They were afraid. Survivors would later admit to terror so profound they could barely function. But they fought anyway, because their shipmates were counting on them, because their captain expected it, because running was not something they could conceive of doing. The kamikaze threat that Laffey faced was the culmination of Japan's strategic desperation. By April 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a conventional fighting force. The great carrier battles of 1942 and 43 had destroyed the cream of Japanese naval aviation. The surface fleet had been annihilated at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. What remained were aircraft without experienced pilots, ships without fuel, and a high command that understood defeat was inevitable, but refused to accept it. The kamikaze strategy emerged from this context, not as a sign of strength, but as an admission of weakness. Yet the kamikazes were tactically effective in ways that conventional attacks were not. A pilot who intended to die did not need to worry about escape routes, fuel reserves, or return navigation. He could press his attack to the absolute limit, accepting hits that would have deterred any pilot who hoped to survive. The Japanese calculated that kamikazes achieved hit rates roughly 10 times higher than conventional bombing attacks, and the evidence from Okinawa supported this estimate. During the campaign, kamikazes sank or damaged hundreds of American ships, killing nearly 5,000 sailors and wounding almost as many. The psychological impact was even greater than the material damage. Sailors who had faced conventional air attacks for years found the kamikazes uniquely terrifying, because there was no negotiating with an enemy who wanted to die. Laffey's survival against this threat was partly a matter of design and partly a matter of luck. The Allen M. Sumner-class destroyers were robustly built, with compartmentalized hulls that could contain flooding from multiple breaches. The ship's damage control systems, including pumps, firefighting equipment, and emergency repair materials, were positioned throughout the vessel for easy access. The crew had been trained in damage control techniques that emphasized speed, flexibility, and improvisation. When compartments flooded, they sealed them off and kept fighting. When fires threatened to spread, they contained them with whatever was available, including seawater that might otherwise have been dangerous to spray near electrical systems. They broke rules that peacetime safety would never have permitted, because peacetime rules did not apply. Luck also played its part. Several kamikazes that should have delivered killing blows instead struck at angles that minimized their damage, or hit sections of the ship that were already destroyed, or detonated their bombs in ways that vented much of the blast overboard. The bomb that jammed Laffey's rudder could just as easily have detonated in a magazine and destroyed the ship entirely. The crashes that killed so many men somehow avoided the critical systems, engines, boilers, main electrical buses that kept the ship operational. A few feet in any direction, a few degrees of angle, a few seconds of timing, and Laffey's story would have ended very differently. The role of the Marine Corsair pilots who came to Laffey's aid deserves special mention. These men flew their aircraft into a maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire, both Japanese and American, to protect a ship they had never seen, crewed by men they did not know. They shot down multiple kamikazes that would otherwise have reached Laffey, fundamentally altering the mathematics of the engagement. Their intervention came at a critical moment, when Laffey's own defenses were nearly exhausted, when a few more hits might have tipped the balance from survival to destruction. The air battle above the ship was as desperate as the sea battle below, with Corsairs chasing kamikazes at wave-top height, firing until their ammunition was gone, then returning to base to rearm and come back for more. Commander Becton's leadership was the human element that held everything together. His decision to keep fighting after the rudder was jammed, after half his guns were destroyed, after casualties mounted beyond anything his medical staff could handle, was the decision that saved his ship. A different commander, equally brave but less determined, might have concluded that resistance was futile, that his duty to his crew required abandoning a dying vessel. Becton never wavered, his voice on the loudspeaker calm and confident, even as explosions rocked the ship, convinced his crew that survival was possible, that their efforts mattered, that the ship would somehow come through. Leadership, in the end, is about creating belief, and Becton created belief when every rational calculation suggested despair. The aftermath of the battle brought recognition and reflection. In the months that followed, as the war ground toward its conclusion with the atomic bombs and the Japanese surrender, the story of Laffey spread through the fleet and beyond. She became a symbol of American naval resilience, proof that men and ships could endure the unendurable if they refused to surrender. Her damaged hulk, towed across the Pacific to American shipyards, was a physical reminder of what had been endured. The Navy, which had lost many ships to kamikazes and would lose more before the war ended, needed symbols of survival. Laffey provided one. For the survivors, the battle left marks that time could not erase. Many carried physical scars, burns, shrapnel wounds, hearing loss from the constant explosions. More carried psychological wounds that would manifest in nightmares, anxiety, and the complex emotions that later generations would call post-traumatic stress. They had seen friends die in ways that no training could prepare them for. They had faced their own mortality for 80 continuous minutes, each moment potentially their last. Some would never speak of the experience. Others would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain it to people who could not possibly understand. The ship herself, after repairs that took the rest of the war and beyond, emerged as something different from what she had been. The Laffey that had gone to Radar Picket Station number 1 was a new destroyer, with a young crew facing their first major combat. The Laffey that emerged from the Seattle shipyards was a veteran, her hull patched with new steel, her superstructure rebuilt, but her identity forever shaped by what had happened on April 16th. She would serve in the Atlantic Fleet for another 2 decades, a Cold War destroyer conducting peacetime operations. But everyone who served on her knew her story. The ship that would not die had earned her name in blood. The lessons of Laffey's battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Navy studied the engagement intensively, seeking to understand how a single destroyer had survived what should have been certain destruction. The conclusions emphasized several factors: the importance of distributed damage control systems, the value of leadership that remained calm under extreme pressure, the necessity of close coordination between surface ships and fighter aircraft, and the sheer unpredictability of combat, where luck and chance played roles that no planning could eliminate. These lessons influenced post-war ship design, leadership training, and operational doctrine for generations. The kamikaze threat itself would never be repeated in quite the same form. Japan's surrender in August 1945 ended the immediate danger, and no subsequent enemy has employed large-scale suicide aircraft attacks against American naval forces. But the strategic logic behind the kamikazes, the calculation that a determined attacker willing to die can defeat conventional defenses, has echoed through subsequent conflicts in different forms. Suicide boats, truck bombs, and other improvised weapons have all drawn, consciously or not, on the same grim mathematics that the Japanese explored in the skies over Okinawa. Laffey herself became a memorial, preserved at Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, where she has rested since 1981. Visitors who walk her decks can see the spots where kamikazes hit, where fires burned, where men died defending their ship. The museum displays photographs of the crew, artifacts from the battle, and recordings of survivor testimony. For many Americans, Laffey is their only direct contact with the naval war in the Pacific, their only opportunity to stand where history happened and imagine what it was like. The story of April 16th, 1945, is ultimately a story about the limits of what human beings can endure and the remarkable things that become possible when those limits are reached. Laffey's crew did not know, when the first kamikaze began its run, that they would face 21 more. They did not know that their ship would still be afloat at the end. They knew only that they had a job to do, that their shipmates depended on them, that surrender was not an option, and so they fought, minute by minute, attack by attack, fire by fire, until there was nothing left to fight. 22 kamikazes attacked the USS Laffey on a spring morning in 1945. 6 of them hit, 4 bombs exploded on her decks. 32 of her crew died, and still she floated, still she fought, still she lived. The ship that would not die earned her name the hardest way possible, through blood and fire, and the absolute refusal of her crew to accept defeat. They are all gone now. The men who served on Laffey that day passed into history like the war they fought. But the ship remains, a monument of steel and memory, testifying to what ordinary people can accomplish when they decide that dying is easier than giving up.